Lionel White, American mystery novelist who wrote The Killing and a lot of other things, had written a kidnapping novel called A Snatch. And it was published in France by Série Noir, Gallimard. And a little crook in Paris read it and said, this thing's a blueprint. It tells you exactly what to do. It says, kidnap a baby because a baby can't identify you. It told them how to get the ransom money. It said, be sure to return the child unharmed, because if you just take money, they'll eventually stop looking for you. But if you kill the kid, they'll never stop looking for you. So he took this book to some friends and said, look, we can do it. And they did it. And it was the crime of the century in France. And they stole the Peugeot heir, the Peugeot automobile. They stole the baby. They did everything, just like the book said. Got the ransom, returned the baby. Everything was fine. They ran out of book. Within a few weeks, they were all arrested. They were essentially just dumb little guys. You know, one of them is buying cars. He's buying fur coats for his girlfriend. One of them is getting drunk in a bar and saying, you know, the Peugeot kidnapping. You know, who could tell you something about the Peugeot kidnapping? You know, and I've always said they should have taken some of the ransom money and hired Lionel White to write a sequel in which they get away.
I suppose you really have to start with Hammett and Chandler. Very quickly after the Second World War, you get a number of writers like David Goodis and Jim Thompson who are responding to the political and cultural atmosphere. A number of things influenced that. The Cold War, primarily, the fear of of atomic weaponry, a permanent wartime economy, things like that, which created pretty much a sort of paranoia in the culture, which people like Thompson and Goodis and other writers responded to. And I think that Thompson, Goodis, Himes, those are like the primary people, I think, in the post-war era. Then you get a whole other type of fiction. You get the writers that come out of the Vietnam era. And there are a lot of similarities, really, between those early writers like James Crumley and George V. Higgins, and the writers who wrote about Vietnam, like Michael Hare and Gustav Hausford and people like that. So, and that's not only, well, it's not really in terms of their narrative, but like what sort of feeds into the narrative, and the way they're sort of describing things, and that sort of hard-boiled attitude that they have towards life, that is sort of slightly cynical. So they're calling on writers and a sort of cultural mix that they're living in at the time, but also they're referring back to people like Chandler and Hammett. And then, I mean, Thompson and people like that are sort of go through a lull and aren't really rediscovered until probably the early 80s, when they go through a revival of sorts. But yeah, dialogue, getting the dialogue right is like an essential part of film noir from the 80s through the 90s to the present.
The fact is that nobody's dialogue is real. I mean, Elmore Leonard's and George V. Higgins and me or anybody, it's all stylized. But the stylization is you stylize to look real. But with Higgins, his stylization was toward transcript, so that if you're reading a book of his, it's as though you're reading a transcript, therefore that must be what they said. I'm not going to try to characterize mine, but Leonard, what Leonard does is just keep circling in the dialogue the same as he keeps circling in the narration. So that looseness and apparent lack of direction is what makes it seem as though that's real, that's what's going on.
Almost every crime writer goes to Hollywood at some point, or has gone to Hollywood at some point, because the money is incredible And it's sort of, you know, you have to do Hollywood. You have to go there and fight this evil force called Hollywood and succeed or not succeed.
Stanley Kubrick and Jim Thompson met at an extremely low point in Thompson's life. He had just come off of one of the strongest and most successful streaks of his life. In roughly a 2.5-year period, he wrote or published, I think, about 14 new novels. But his editor at Lion Books, Arnold Haino, had just left. The paperback market was drying up for him and to a certain extent for everybody. So there's a real way in which you could say that Stanley Kubrick rescued Jim Thompson. I think there's also a way in which you can say that Jim Thompson rescued Stanley Kubrick. To play a film critic for a minute, Kubrick's prior film to The Killing is The Killer's Kiss, and it's a brilliant film visually and in almost every other way except for the screenplay. And in my opinion, it really doesn't have a screenplay. And I think what Thompson gave Kubrick in the Killing was a taut and refined and elegant screenplay steeped in the American vernacular.
That film, I think, influenced a lot of future films, including films like Reservoir Dogs. The way it concentrated on character, the way the time overlapped, the way the narrative structure of it. There were a lot of aspects to that film which you can later see in film noir of the 1990s.
I grew up in the cold, dark Northeast, and you spend a lot of winters with a lot of snowballs, and the best snowball has a stone in it. And Parker talks like that. All of his snowballs have stones in them. And that, what Point Blank didn't quite do that. Point Blank was more ornate and poetic, but it went its way. It went very well in its way.
At that time, this is 1966. I went out there to do Point Blank, and we were looking. I mean, what was going on then? It was Fellini and Bergman were at their peak, and the whole French New Wave was going. It was tremendous, and that burst into, that really translated in America into the 70s. I mean, the 70s, which is a great period in American movies, was really a result of that influence coming from Europe.
Yeah, the thrillers or film noirs or whatever you want to call them, I think for anybody who's interested in having to say anything at all, this is a great conveyor belt. I mean, one, the stories are good. One's always intrigued as to know what's going to happen. But more importantly, you can offer a kind of autopsy of society as it is when you're making that film. In the same way as with Carter, one was actually examining the kind of corrupt soul of my own country, actually, which I knew was there, which I think a lot of the populace were denying, and you were able to explore that.
There are times when it's absolutely on your side. It's very in your interest to have no money. Well, if you're making your first film, by definition, you don't have very much money. So the idea that you make this rather sort of abrupt, violent film, which doesn't have long, expensive elements in, it's sort of common sense. It's also close to the street, so I guess you can make them cheaper than many films. And the melodrama sustains the lack of production values.
Noir became a big industry in the 1990s. When you walk into a bookshop and you'd see, just hundreds of books, by writers, you've never heard of, and everybody, seems to have written a crime novel. And I think a lot of the subversiveness has been written out of it, really. And I think that goes for film noir as well. But you do get, I think it's still possible to be subversive within the genre. And you get, writers it's very hard to sustain though. So you get writers who write, you know, 1, 2, 3 really great novels, maybe 4 novels, and then, you know, hit a sort of dry patch. And in terms of filmmaking, well, there's not a lot, but there's, you know, every once in a while you see a great example of film noir that, you know, it reminds you that it can still be done. Because essentially it's still, you know, at its best, it still is a genre that criticizes the culture, that shows the culture, the sort of contradictions within the culture.